class at Holmes Elementary School, standing at about 4 feet 4 inches tall. The 9-year-old had aspirations of becoming a full-fledged campfire girl. On March 6, 1959, she went out to sell campfire girl mints near her home on West Mission Avenue, but she never returned home, causing a massive search effort the likes of which Spokane had never seen before.
Night was closing in over Spokane, Washington. Somewhere out there, a 9-year-old girl had vanished. Searchers moved through the dark, scanning roadsides, fields, and riverbanks, while scattered boxes of campfire mints marked the only trail she seemed to have left behind. Her name was Candy Rogers. And on the night of March 6, 1959, an entire city began asking the same terrifying question. What happened to her? For 62 years, Spokane would carry that question. The case went cold. Leads dried up. Suspects came and went. But one piece of evidence survived the decades. And long after most people believed the truth would never come, that evidence finally pointed to the man who killed her. But before we get into this chilling case, in today's case, we're looking at the haunting story of Candy Rogers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us get into it. Candy Rogers was only 9 years old. She lived in Spokane's West Central neighborhood, in a time when communities still believed children could move safely through the familiar streets around their homes. She was a 4th grader, a little girl known not for danger or controversy, but for ordinary things. School, neighbors, family, routine. The kind of child whose life still revolved around simple assignments, trusted errands, and the small social world that exists only in childhood. Candy was also a bluebird, part of the younger age group connected to the campfire girls. That mattered, because it placed her in the middle of an activity that seemed harmless, even wholesome. Selling campfire mints door to door was not unusual. It was the kind of thing families allowed because it felt safe. It felt structured. It felt supervised by the values of the neighborhood itself. A child could leave the house with a purpose, knock on a few doors, speak to familiar adults, and return home before long. No one imagined that a task so small could become the opening chapter of one of Spokane's most haunting crimes. That is what makes this story so devastating. Nothing about that day looked like the beginning of a nightmare. There was no visible warning. No sign that Candy was stepping into the kind of danger that would grip an entire city for decades. She did not leave home for some reckless adventure. She did not wander miles away. She went out to do something ordinary, something innocent, something that, by every standard of the time, should have ended with a child walking back through the front door before supper. And that is exactly why her disappearance hit so hard. The people around her did not see her as vulnerable in the way we might think now. In 1959, a child moving through her own neighborhood still belonged to the rhythm of daily life. Streets were not yet perceived through the same lens of fear. Parents worried, of course, but the fear was different. It had not yet been sharpened by decades of missing child alerts, CCTV footage, digital timelines, and instant communication. Back then, trust lasted longer. Alarm arrived later. Evil was assumed to be farther away. Candy's route that day was supposed to stay close to home. That detail matters, because it narrows the emotional distance between safety and catastrophe. She was not supposed to vanish into some remote place. She was supposed to remain inside the boundary of what felt known, inside the geography of reassurance, inside the world where neighbors recognized one another and children returned when called. But for Candy Rogers, that ordinary Friday in March would become the last normal day of her life. And for Spokane, that simple fact would be impossible to forget. It was Friday, March 6, 1959. Candy went out in west central Spokane to sell campfire mints door to door. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The errand itself fit neatly into the rhythm of the afternoon. A child walking through familiar streets. A few brief stops. A handful of small exchanges. Then a return home. But that return never came. As daylight began to fade and evening approached, the ordinary shape of the day started to break apart. Candy had been expected back. Enough time had passed for concern to appear, then deepen, then sharpen into fear. What begins as a parent glancing at the clock turns into something else entirely when the minutes keep stacking up and the door never opens. At first, people search for simple explanations because the mind resists the worst one. Maybe she stayed out longer than planned. Maybe she stopped to talk. Maybe she took a different route. Maybe she lost track of time. Every early explanation tries to preserve normalcy. Every passing minute tears that normalcy down. By the time her family understood that Candy was truly missing, the case was already wounded by the limitations of its era. There were no cell phones, no location tracking, no surveillance cameras preserving her final route, no digital footprint to reconstruct where she had gone, who had seen her, or what vehicle may have passed near her. Once a child disappeared into the gaps of the evening in 1959, the darkness itself became a suspect. It swallowed timelines. It erased certainty. It left investigators with fragments instead of answers. Then came the first real clue. Boxes of campfire mints believed to be candies were found strewn along Petite Drive, appearing to lead north away from west-central Spokane. It was the kind of detail that changes the emotional texture of a case instantly. A lost child might still be found. A trail of abandoned candy boxes suggests interruption. It suggests movement under pressure. It suggests that something happened before she ever made it home. But even this clue was maddeningly incomplete. The boxes did not explain whether Candy had dropped them herself, whether they had fallen during a struggle, or whether they had been scattered later. They did not reveal who had been with her, whether she had entered a vehicle, or whether the route itself had been intentionally staged to mislead searchers. The evidence pointed toward danger, but it did not point cleanly enough toward a person, and that uncertainty changed everything. The case was no longer about a child who was late coming home. It was now about a child who may have been taken, a child whose belongings were found without her, a child who had stepped out to do something simple and had vanished inside the boundaries of her own city. By nightfall, fear was no longer private. It was communal. Spokane was about to begin searching for Candy Rogers. Once it became clear that Candy was missing, Spokane mobilized. Police, volunteers, and multiple supporting organizations joined the effort. This was no quiet neighborhood search carried out by a few anxious relatives walking block after block. It rapidly expanded into something much larger. The city was not dealing with a routine disappearance. It was confronting the terrifying possibility that a little girl had vanished into danger and that every passing hour was pulling her farther away. A command post was established at what is now the intersection of Petite Drive and the T.J. Minack Bridge. From there, search efforts were organized and directed across the surrounding terrain. This detail matters because it shows how seriously the case was taken from the start. The authorities were not waiting passively for information to drift in. They were building a response. They were widening the perimeter. They were turning geography into strategy. Soon, about 200 searchers were scouring the area. That number says something important about how deeply this case struck the community. Candy's disappearance did not remain inside her family's grief. It spread outward. It became public fear. It became an emergency that demanded bodies on the ground, eyes on the roadsides, and coordinated movement across land that might conceal a clue or a child. People searched with urgency because the worst truth about missing children is simple. Time matters. Every hour without an answer changes what kind of answer may still be possible. And then the search grew even larger. Among those who assisted was the U.S. Air Force. A helicopter crew was brought in to search from the air, extending the effort beyond what could be done on foot alone. From above, terrain can be read differently. Paths, breaks in the landscape, objects out of place, and possible routes of movement become more visible. The city was using every available resource to find Candy. But then the search itself turned tragic. On the day after Candy disappeared, a U.S. Air Force Sikorsky H-19 helicopter involved in the search struck high-tension power lines and crashed into the Spokane River. What had already begun as a devastating child disappearance now deepened into a broader catastrophe. The effort to save one life had now claimed others. Those killed in the crash were Airman Marlis D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. M.C. Donnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fautek. 2 crew members survived. That moment changed the emotional scale of the case forever. This was no longer just the disappearance of one child, horrific as that already was. The search itself had now cost lives. The city's desperate attempt to bring Candy home had produced another layer of grief, another wound attached to her name, another reminder that tragedy was spreading outward in concentric circles. For the people of Spokane, the case was becoming unforgettable in real time. A missing child, a city on edge, a military search operation, a fatal helicopter crash in the Spokane River. Everything about the case kept growing darker. And yet, for all the manpower, the aerial searches, the physical danger, and the collective determination, Candy was still missing. No one knew where she was. No one knew whether she was still alive. And the question hanging over Spokane was becoming harder to bear with every passing day. 2 weeks passed. That gap is important because it transformed the nature of hope. In the earliest hours of a missing child case, people imagine rescue. They imagine confusion, injury, even temporary captivity. But as days stretch on, hope begins to thin. It does not disappear all at once. It wears down. It becomes more fragile, more conditional, more desperate. Then, on March 21, 1959, a grim clue appeared. 2 airmen from Fairchild were out hunting in a wooded area off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's house, when they found a pair of girls' shoes. They later reported the discovery. It was the kind of moment investigators fear and families dread. A child's belongings found far from home rarely signal safety. They signal the approach of an answer no one wants. The next morning, March 22, 1959, searchers returned to the area at daylight. They did not have to search long. Within minutes, Candy's body was found under a shallow layer of brush and pine needles. That detail is chilling because it reveals both concealment and haste. She had not simply been left in the open. Someone had taken some step, however minimal, to hide what had been done. Not deeply, not permanently, but enough to suggest intention. Enough to show that this was not an accidental death or an impulsive abandonment without awareness. There was an effort to place her out of sight. Then came the full horror of what had happened. Candy had been raped and strangled to death with a piece of her own clothing. At that point, the case changed permanently. There would be no reunion, no rescue, no hope of finding a frightened little girl alive and bringing her back to the people who loved her. The city was no longer searching for Candy. It was now searching for the person who had abducted, assaulted, and murdered a 9-year-old child. And because of the nature of the crime, the investigation took on a different urgency. This was not only a homicide. It was the act of someone capable of calculated violence against a child in a familiar neighborhood setting. That fact widened the fear. If Candy could be taken while doing something so ordinary, then the danger did not feel distant or abstract. It felt local. It felt present. It felt unresolved in the most frightening possible way. For her family, the discovery shattered the last remaining possibility of relief. For detectives, it began the long and exhausting work of identifying a killer in an era with very few forensic advantages. For Spokane, the case became something else entirely. Not just a tragedy. A wound. A memory that would refuse to heal. Once Candy was found, the investigation intensified. Detectives worked through thousands of tips and leads. That flood of information is common in notorious cases, but volume does not equal clarity. Every tip creates a possible path, and every possible path demands time, energy, interviews, verification, and elimination. Some tips come from frightened witnesses, some from rumor, some from people desperate to be helpful, some from those projecting suspicion onto neighbors, strangers, drifters, or local men whose behavior unsettled them for unrelated reasons. In a case this emotionally charged, the investigation risked being overwhelmed not by silence, but by noise. Several suspects were developed over time. That means investigators did not lack theories. They lacked proof strong enough to bring the case to a definitive legal conclusion. This distinction matters. A detective can feel convinced. A community can form opinions. A suspect can look plausible. But without evidence that holds together under scrutiny, a case stalls. And when a case involving a murdered child stalls, the frustration becomes generational. The year 1959 imposed brutal limits. There was no meaningful DNA-based forensic route available to detectives. Biological evidence could be collected, preserved, and examined within the constraints of the time, but it could not yet speak with the precision that modern science would eventually allow. There was no forensic genetic genealogy, no advanced database matching, no future-facing lab process that could turn a preserved specimen into a family tree and then into a name. Investigators were forced to rely on traditional methods. They interviewed people, they compared alibis, they followed behavioral patterns, they assessed geographic access, they examined who lived nearby, who had histories of violence, who might have been in the area, who might have known Candy, and who might have crossed her path by chance. This kind of work is painstaking, and sometimes heroic. but it is still limited by the tools available. A strong detective in 1959 could narrow suspicion. He could build a case theory. He could expose lies. But if the final link depended on a form of science that did not yet exist, the truth could remain sealed inside the evidence itself. And that is exactly what happened here. Months became years. Years became decades. The case was handed from one generation of detectives to the next. Officers retired. New investigators inherited old reports. Files aged. People who once remembered vivid details died, moved away, or forgot. Witness memories softened. Potential suspects aged out of scrutiny or disappeared entirely. A case like this does not stay frozen. It erodes. And every year that passes tends to weaken the parts of an investigation that depend on living memory. But some cases never release their grip on a department. Candy Rogers' murder became one of those cases. It was not measured in hours. It was not measured in one season of detective work, or one failed lead, or one suspect who could not be tied conclusively to the crime. It was measured in careers. That idea captures something essential about the case. It endured long enough to outlast the working lives of the people trying to solve it. That kind of unsolved crime changes the identity of an institution. Every cold case file represents unfinished work, but the murder of a child is different. It lingers harder. It acquires emotional weight. It becomes a moral burden carried by people who were not even there when the crime occurred. Detectives who never met Candy still inherited responsibility for her. Investigators who were not yet born in 1959 would one day look into the face of this old case file and understand that the city was still waiting. And by the time the case reached that point, it was no longer just an investigation. It was a promise. A promise that if science ever caught up, if the right fragment survived, if one overlooked thread finally held, someone would try again. Before we go any further, if you're still with me in this case, comment "I'm still here." The Candy Rogers case remained unsolved for so long because it sat at the intersection of two opposing truths. The crime was serious enough to generate enormous effort, but the era in which it occurred was primitive by modern forensic standards. That combination can keep a case suspended for decades. One of the most important details in this case is that evidence from 1959 was preserved well enough that usable DNA could still be extracted 62 years later. That is extraordinary. Evidence handling in the late 1950s did not operate with the future of forensic genealogy in mind. No one preserving those items could have fully known what technology would one day make possible. And yet somehow, through time, storage, institutional continuity, and perhaps a measure of luck, material survived that could eventually speak. That preserved evidence became the quiet center of the case. For decades, however, it remained silent, and while the evidence waited, the public understanding of the case remained incomplete. The future killer was not publicly established as the answer. His name did not emerge as the clear, widely known solution in the earlier life of the investigation. That matters because it means the case did not remain cold due to neglect alone. It remained cold because the truth was not obvious through ordinary detective methods. The right person was not cleanly exposed by the evidence available at the time in a way that could be acted upon conclusively. This is what separates a true cold case from a merely paused investigation. In some cases, police know exactly who they believe did it but cannot prove it. In others, the crime remains unsolved because the field of possible suspects is too broad, the evidence too weak, and the path to certainty too narrow. Candy's case carried elements of both uncertainty and persistence. Detectives kept returning to it because something about the crime demanded that they do so. But return is not resolution. Dedication is not proof. Meanwhile, the case settled into Spokane's memory. It became one of those stories that lasts longer than the original headlines. The kind of crime people mention decades later with the same sorrow, the same disbelief, and the same lingering question. Communities do not remember every old case equally. Some disappear into archive boxes and public amnesia. Others remain alive because they represent something that never made emotional sense. A little girl goes out in her own neighborhood to sell mint boxes and is murdered. That fact resists forgetting. For Candy's family, the passage of time did not end the case. For the police department, the passage of time did not erase obligation. And for the city, the passage of time did not soften the injustice. Instead, the years created a strange and painful condition. Everyone knew the case mattered, but no one could yet force it to yield its final answer. So the file endured, the questions endured, the grief endured, and buried inside preserved evidence, the truth endured too. In early 2021, the case finally entered a new era. Spokane police investigators, working with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, learned of an advanced DNA testing method offered by a laboratory in Texas. For an old case like Candy Rogers, this was not just another technical update. It was a new door, a chance to ask an old piece of evidence a question that had once been impossible. Investigators submitted a semen sample collected from Candy's clothing. That sentence carries enormous weight. For more than 6 decades, that sample had existed as evidence of violation, evidence of murder, evidence of a person who had come close enough to Candy to destroy her life. But in 1959, it could not identify him. In 2021, it might. The lab work produced a DNA profile. That profile was then entered into a genealogy database. This is where the case begins to transform from traditional investigation into something both scientific and almost genealogical in structure. Rather than matching the sample directly to a known offender already sitting in a criminal database, investigators could use family relationships, inherited markers, and shared ancestry to begin constructing the outline of the unknown man behind the crime. This process did not immediately produce one clean answer. Instead, it narrowed the possible matches to 3 brothers. That is an extraordinary reduction when you consider the span of time involved. The unknown killer who had evaded definitive identification for 62 years was no longer hidden in the whole population. He was now likely inside one family line. From there, the work became both analytical and strategic. One of the possible matches was John Ray Hoff. Police noted that he was the only one of the 3 brothers who had offspring. That detail mattered because it provided investigators with a practical route to testing the theory. If a living child of the suspect could be found and would cooperate, the investigators could compare the genetic relationship between her DNA and the DNA recovered from Candy's clothing. After 6 decades of uncertainty, the case had suddenly become painfully close to resolution, but the investigators still had to be careful. A cold case solved publicly and incorrectly would be another form of injustice. Naming a dead man without overwhelming evidence would not only risk error, it would stain families, distort history, and undermine the very science that made the breakthrough possible. So detectives did not leap from possibility to announcement. They advanced the way serious investigators must advance. Slowly, reluctantly, methodically. This was the turning point. Not the press conference. Not the public reveal. Not the moment the city finally heard a name. The real turning point came here, when science caught up to history and the long silent evidence finally began to answer back. Once investigators identified John Ray Hoff as a possible match, the next challenge was confirmation. That meant moving from probability toward certainty. Detectives reached out to Hoff's daughter. According to Spokane police, she quickly met with investigators and provided a DNA sample. That cooperation is one of the quieter but deeply important details in the story. Long after the crime, long after the suspect himself had died, the path to truth still depended on living people making difficult choices. Her participation helped move the case from theory into evidence strong enough to be measured. The first results were significant. Investigators found that it was 2.9 million times more likely that her DNA was related to the recovered specimen than DNA from the general population. For many people, a number like that sounds final, but detectives understood the sensitivity of what they were doing. This was not a living suspect who could be interviewed, confronted, charged, or tried. This was a man who had been dead for decades. If they were going to tell Spokane that Candy Rogers' killer had finally been identified, then they needed the strongest confirmation possible. Because once that name was announced, it would live in history forever. So investigators took the next step. They obtained a warrant to exhume Hoff's body and collect DNA directly. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the entire case, not because it is sensational, but because of what it symbolizes. A murder committed in 1959 had reached across 62 years, through evolving science, preserved evidence, and the patience of multiple generations of detectives, to compel the opening of a grave in search of a final answer. The comparison was then made, and the result was overwhelming. The final analysis showed it was 25 quintillion times more likely that the semen sample came from John Ray Hoff than from an unrelated person chosen at random. At that point, The case crossed the threshold from informed conclusion to conclusive identification. The man who raped and murdered Candy Rogers was no longer an abstraction, no longer a faceless predator hiding somewhere in the unanswered past, no longer a theory, no longer one possibility among many. He had a name, but the emotional complexity of that moment is part of what makes this case so powerful, because the name did not arrive with handcuffs. It did not arrive with a trial. It did not arrive with a confession. It arrived through science, after the suspect was already gone. The truth had been found. Justice, in the formal sense, never would be. The man identified as Candy Rogers' killer was John Ray Hoff. He was 20 years old at the time of her murder. He had grown up in Spokane and lived about a mile from Candy in the West Central neighborhood. That proximity is disturbing because it shrinks the imagined distance between victim and offender. For decades, people often picture child killers as outsiders, drifters, men who appear from nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. But in many cases, the real answer is less dramatic and more unnerving. The danger was not far away. It was local. It was part of the city's own human landscape. Hoff entered the Army at age 17 and was stationed at missile sites around Fairchild Air Force Base. On paper, that background may have given him the outward structure of a young man with direction, but outward structure can hide inward violence. Nothing in a uniform guarantees moral character. Nothing about military service erases the possibility of predation, and in Hoff's later history, a disturbing pattern would emerge. In 1961, he was convicted of second-degree assault with intent to rob. Spokane police said he accosted a female victim, forcibly removed her clothes, tied her up using her own garments, and strangled her before fleeing. The victim survived. Hoff served 6 months in jail. This later attack matters for several reasons. First, it gives context to the kind of offender he appears to have been. Violence, sexual humiliation, restraint, and strangulation were not isolated abstractions in his behavioral profile. There was a recognizable brutality there. Second, it shows how close society may come to identifying a dangerous person without fully understanding what they have already done. By 1961, Candy had already been dead for 2 years. Yet the man who killed her was still moving through the world, still capable of violently attacking another female victim. Based on that conviction, Hoff was declared a deserter from the Army and discharged. Afterward, he worked as a door-to-door salesman and at a lumber yard. These details matter not because they are dramatic, but because they show how ordinary a killer can appear in the spaces between his acts of violence. He was not frozen in time as the monster of one terrible day. He kept living, kept working, kept occupying roles that sounded mundane. That is often one of the hardest truths in true crime. Monstrous acts are frequently committed by people who can still walk through everyday life without immediate detection. Then, in 1970, at age 31, John Ray Hoff died by suicide. And with that, the possibility of traditional justice died with him. No arrest would ever come. No courtroom testimony, no conviction pronounced in public, no moment in which Candy's family could sit across from the man who stole her life. He escaped earthly accountability in the legal sense, but he did not escape identification. And in the end, history caught up to him anyway. On November 19, 2021, Spokane police publicly announced that the Candy Rogers case had been solved. After 62 years, the city finally heard the answer that had eluded generations of detectives, haunted surviving family members, and remained buried inside the evidence all that time. The identification came through advanced DNA analysis, forensic genealogy, and traditional detective work. That combination matters because none of those elements alone fully explains the resolution. Science created the pathway, but detectives still had to preserve the evidence, reopen the file, interpret the results, verify the family line, seek the warrant, and insist on certainty before speaking publicly. That is what solved the case. Not luck, not a sudden confession, not a deathbed revelation, not one miraculous break descending out of nowhere. It was patient work across decades finally meeting the right scientific moment. But what does solved mean in a case like this? It means the killer was identified conclusively. It means the question of who murdered Candy Rogers now has an answer supported by overwhelming forensic evidence. It means the city no longer has to describe the case as an unsolved mystery. But solved does not mean satisfied. Because by the time Spokane police announced the truth, John Ray Hoff had been dead for decades. There would be no arrest, no trial, no jury, no legal verdict spoken in a courtroom. The resolution was real, but it was incomplete in the one way many people understand justice best. The law had no living defendant left to confront. That tension is part of what gives the ending its emotional force. There is relief in knowing. There is pain in knowing too late. And in crimes involving children, that pain feels especially sharp because the life that was stolen never had the chance to continue, while the man responsible moved through years of adulthood before dying on his own terms. So yes, the case was solved, but comfort is not the same as closure. For 62 years, Spokane asked who killed Candy Rogers. For 62 years, that question lingered over the city, over the police department, over the archives of a case that refused to disappear, and over the memory of a 9-year-old girl who left home to sell mints and never came back. On November 19, 2021, science finally answered. But even a true answer can arrive wearing grief. Candy Rogers' case is no longer an unsolved mystery. The uncertainty is gone. The identity of the killer is known. The long silence inside the evidence has been broken. Yet the tragedy remains unchanged in the ways that hurt most. Candy is still gone. Her childhood was still taken from her in a moment of horrifying violence. Her family still lived through decades without the full truth. And the man who did it was never forced to stand in public and hear what he had done named before the law. That is why this ending feels both powerful and incomplete. The mystery ended. The grief never did. And maybe that is the final truth in cases like this. Sometimes justice arrives only as knowledge. Sometimes the best a city can do is refuse to forget, preserve what it can, and keep asking until science becomes capable of answering what the past tried to bury. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She stepped into her neighborhood on an ordinary March day in 1959. And though it took more than 6 decades, the truth finally found its way back to her name. If you made it all the way to the end, write justice for Candy in the comments. And tell me what you think. After 62 years, does finally knowing the truth feel like justice? Or does justice come too late when the killer is already gone? If you want more real cases told with care, detail, and respect for the victims, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell me where you're watching from.